MG founder Cecil Kimber wanted to make cars that would be, in his words, affordable and fun to drive. Well, this ZS model is a small SUV that claims to tick both those boxes while offering class-leading interior space and exceptional value for money. It all sounds promising and should deliver what ought to be the company's most credible contender yet.
You probably won't associate the MG brand with SUVs, but that's what this Chinese-owned maker concentrates on these days. Here's the most important one, the super mini-sized ZS. This is one of the most affordable models of this kind, but despite that, you probably won't have considered it. We're here to decide whether you should. The ZS badge has been used before on an MG. In 2001, when it designated a sportier version of the Rover 45 saloon that sold until the wind-up of the MG Rover business in 2005. Fortunately, this new era MG ZS is nothing like that, and it's made by a manufacturer that has very little in common with the way the company was back then. SAIC, the Shanghai Automotive Industry Corporation, bought the remains of Rover and the MG brand in 2007 in a deal that included use of the once great Longbridge factory in Birmingham. To begin with, SAIC used this plant to screw together models from parts shipped over from China, thus imbuing them with a token level of Britishness. The brand doesn't bother with that anymore. Like its only slightly larger SUV stablemate, the GS, this XS model is made and assembled in Shanghai, but that still doesn't make it a completely Chinese product. MG claims that the version of the car that we get here has been re-engineered specifically for a UK audience and developed for optimal ride and handling on our appalling roads. Well, we'll see. What we already know, though, is that this ZS has the most spacious interior in its class, the most comprehensive warranty, and a price that'll save you thousands over obvious rivals. It's a proposition you could see a lot of people being quite tempted by. But only if the product itself is right. Some previous models produced under the Chinese ownership of this brand haven't been, but the launch in 2016 of this car's showroom stablemate, that larger GS SUV model, showed that things were on the right track. Progress further consolidated when this ZS crossover was introduced at the end of 2017. This model is tasked with lowering the average age of MG buyers in this country, currently rather high at 45. And it's expected to almost double the company's sales in our market, which would make MG this country's fastest growing automotive brand. But would you want one? Time to find out. Other brands, particularly in this segment, could learn a thing or two from the way that MG has taken particular trouble to tailor the road-going dynamics of this ZS, specifically for the UK. Development teams pounded over our nation's terrible tarmac for thousands of miles in an attempt to hone the apparently quite unremarkable steering and suspension combination served up by this design in its other global guises. And to good effect. The result of all this hard work is a car that manages to be one of the more engaging contenders in the small SUV sector. To be fair, that's not saying very much. The bar in this class hasn't been set very high, but at least MG has made more of an effort with ride and handling than is the case with some of this model's better-known rivals. You'll notice that quite soon into your first drive in a ZS. You'll certainly feel bumps and sharper undulations, but they're not as unsettling to this car as they would be to many of its rivals. Body roll through the bends is kept in reasonable check, unless you really start to push it, but then at that point the ESP stability control system quite abruptly intervenes to spoil the fun anyway. For this UK spec, we'd suggest that MG could dial that setup back a little. The improvements made to the chassis package for our market mean that it doesn't need nannying quite that much. The steering helps too, or at least it does if you don't fiddle with it. Avoid entry-level trim and you get the dubious benefit of a 3-mode system for altering feel at the helm. The super light urban setting is useful for parking, while a dynamic option artificially weights things up to aid more enthusiastic progress. Most owners will initially play with these modes, then forget about them, which is no bad thing because the default normal setup gives you the best balance of feedback and assistance. Now, you'll be wanting to know about engines. For mainstream buyers, there are two, both petrol-powered and only offered in a form driving through the front wheels. The most affordable option is a normally aspirated 1.5-litre 4-cylinder unit developing 106 PS and mated to a 5-speed manual gearbox. The same relatively old-tech VTI-tech package that MG uses in its MG3 Super Mini. As there, you get a power plant that revs quite keenly and to some extent makes up for a relative lack of overall efficiency by delivering quite an encouraging set of performance stats. Top speed is 109 miles an hour and the rest a 62 mile an hour sprint occupies 10.9 seconds. That kind of acceleration is about a second or so quicker than the segment norm, though with some rivals the gap would be even bigger. An entry-level petrol-powered Citroën C3 Aircross, for example, takes nearly 16 seconds to cover the same increment. Aware of the preference amongst other more expensive small SUV rivals for more modern downsized 3-cylinder turbo petrol engines, MG thought that it'd provide ZS buyers with the option of one of those too. Hence the company decision to buy in, from General Motors, the 1-litre T GDI 111 PS unit that we're trying here. It's a perky little power plant when fitted to, say, a Vauxhall Corsa, but it doesn't feel like that here. That's because someone, somewhere in MG's hierarchy, has decided that it should only be available to ZS buyers mated to a sprint-sapping 6-speed automatic gearbox that also kills many of the potential efficiency gains that this lighter powertrain might otherwise be able to deliver. For reference, 62 miles an hour from rest takes 12.4 seconds on the way to 112 miles an hour. But more relevantly, torque rises from 141 to 160 newton meters, giving you noticeably more pulling power through the gears. Despite that, the braked towing capacity remains at half a tonne for both engines, so even smaller caravans and trailers are often going to be beyond the scope of this MG's pulling abilities. Is the 1-litre engine worth the substantial premium being asked for it? Unless you're urban bound and really want an automatic gearbox, we'd say probably not. The running costs of this variant are significantly higher, and at speed we've found that the transmission tends to shuffle a little indecisively around between 5th and 6th gear. Mind you, it will create a more refined overall package if you're regularly going to be using your ZS for highway motoring or slightly longer trips. The alternative 1.5-litre unit's constant need to be revved to extract meaningful performance can get wearing in such use, particularly as that combines with noticeable wind and road noise that's picked up around the bodywork and the windows. What else? Will it go off-road? Well, it'll certainly handle a dry, unsurfaced track, but the lack of all-wheel traction and the relatively modest ground clearance, between 135 and 144 millimetres depending on wheel size, mean that we'd advise against attempting anything more ambitious than that. The approach and departure angles that you can achieve, 17 and 23 degrees respectively, if you have a ZS with 17-inch wheels, are certainly very modest. That's really the difference between buying a lifestyle crossover like this as opposed to choosing a similarly priced budget brand small SUV like, say, a Dacia Duster or a SsangYong Corando. Cars like that provide some measure of off-road expertise, but you pay for it with more ponderous tarmac handling. Like most crossover class buyers, likely ZS customers won't want to make that kind of compromise. For them, this MG's suitability will be judged by its prowess in the urban jungle. And here, it's certainly much more in its element, particularly in this 1-litre automatic guise. There's the required high-set driving position that cars in this class ought to deliver, but sometimes don't, which obviously helps in traffic and when you're trying to slot into a tight space, something further aided on most models by the standard fitment of rear parking sensors. The 11.1 metre turning circle is acceptably tight too, completion of which is helped by that selectable urban steering setting that I mentioned earlier. A better package for city folk, though, might well be the ZSE plug-in hybrid model that the brand was keen to talk about at the launch of more mainstream variants. Here, we're promised satisfying sophistication for thousands less than the expected rate. Get to know the wider ZS range, and it's a theme that you'll get well familiar with. This ZS model apparently showcases the future design direction for MG, expressing what the brand calls an emotional dynamism that's due to feature across all forthcoming models. Presumably, what this actually means is that future designs from the company will be fairly class generic, because that's the kind of styling approach that all notable rivals talk about. Segment conformity is certainly what's been served up here. From the front, it could be a Mazda. From the rear, you might be reminded of a Kia. In both cases, though, you sense that these are comparisons the brand will be quite comfortable with. What's important is that the styling of this ZS shouldn't advertise its budget brand pricing. Most will agree that that box has been ticked here. The front end is certainly easier on the eye than is the case with the angled snout of MG's slightly larger compact SUV offering, the GS. This smaller model gets a proper conventional grille with a chrome frame extending into headlights, incorporating no fewer than 23 LEDs. Lower down, most models get these front fog lights, flanking more diamond-style hatching above the usual faux silver skid plate that all models in this class seem to feel they have to have. But we should get beyond mere aesthetics, because there's something a little more interesting going on here when you start to look at how MG has chosen to size this car. The brand makes no bones about the fact that it's targeting the smallest SUV sector with this model, but it's also quick to point out that this car's overall body length is actually closer to a Qashqai class contender from the next segment up. Now, to illustrate that, we'll tell you that this ZS is fully 179mm longer than a little Nissan Juke, but only 80mm shorter than a Nissan Qashqai. You get the idea. Now, this isn't the first compact crossover to attempt to straddle these two market segments. Models like Honda's HR-V, Vauxhall's Mokka-X and Mitsubishi's ASX all try and pull the same trick. But it's the first to do this so affordably. There aren't too many other notable observations to make from a profile perspective, which features a high waistline underscored by an upper styling crease that flows above the door handles and a more overt swage line that emphasises the rear haunches. As for things you'd always expect from an SUV in this sector, well, there's no colour contrasting roof option, but smart roof rails are present and correct on most variants, as are the black plastic-clad arches that you need these smaller 17-inch wheels to properly fill. I was just talking about the fact that this ZS is a bit longer than the segment norm. Well, it's a bit wider too, 44mm wider than a Juke, for example, which is quite a big increment in a car of this size. The way that the rear end has been styled seeks to draw your attention to that, with sweeping tail lamps and these neat lower chrome-framed corner cluster panels for the reflectors. As usual with SUVs of this sort, there's a subtle roof spoiler and a lower silver skid plate to finish things off. In short, it all looks smart enough, but in the past with MG models of the Chinese era, it's been cabin quality that's let the side down. Will this ZS improve on that showing? In a word, yes. Here's an interior that at last in an MG needs no major apologies. No, yes, it feels cheap, but what can you expect for the asking price type comments need apply. We won't get carried away here. The brand is still some way away from the kind of cabin quality you'd get in this sector in, say, a Volkswagen T-Cross or a Mazda CX-3. But then those products are significantly more expensive. More relevantly though, is the fit and finish here really much different from more comparably priced small crossovers like Renault's Captur or Citroen's C3 Aircross? Not really. And it's hugely better than what's served up by rival budget brand small SUVs like SsangYong's Tivoli and Dacia's Duster. Part of that's down to more cohesive Europeanised design, and part of it relates to the fact that the Chinese bean counters are finally getting the idea that it doesn't do to try and make production cost savings in an area so crucial to the day-to-day experience of automotive ownership. Hence, for example, the carbon fibre style trimming around the centre stack, the soft touch coating for the upper dash top, these stylised jet style corner air vents, and the supple faux leather that trims the steering wheel and gear knob. Talking of leather, you probably wouldn't expect to get it trimming the upholstery within the average budget assigned to a car of this kind, but that's a standard feature on the top exclusive ZS variant that we're trying here, as is quite a lot else, including a navigation system for this large 8-inch centre dash display. This is a screen that offers quite a lot, but needs a slightly easier operating interface. This monitor is standard, providing you avoid entry-level trim, but you have to have it if you're going to get things like a DAB digital radio and an Apple CarPlay feature that lets you duplicate smartphone functions onto the fascia screen and use your favourite apps. Unfortunately, though, there's no Android Auto compatibility, so if you don't have an iPhone, you'll be a bit stuck. This monitor could do with a more obvious home screen back button too. The first time you drive this car, you'll almost certainly miss the fact that to get this functionality, you have to hit the centre of the volume knob. Another thing that MG has forgotten to provide is reach adjustment for the steering wheel. It only adjusts up and down for rake. Combine this with the fact that only top variants get seat height adjustment, and you can easily end up with a situation in a ZS where finding a truly comfortable driving position can be a touch difficult. At least once you achieve it, the properly high-set seating stance gives you decent all-round forward vision. Your rear three-quarter view isn't quite as good thanks to quite a large C-pillar blind spot that makes the rear parking sensors you get above entry-level trim pretty vital. There are plenty of low-cost scratchy plastics in evidence the lower down the fascia you look, but we're minded to overlook that given that this is the case with most contenders in this class, even some well above this car's affordable price point. We're less inclined to forgive the fake plastic stitching that adorns the top of the dash though, evidence that some elements of yesteryear Far Eastern design still persist here. What else? Well, this three-spoke wheel looks and feels good, though I still haven't figured out what the up and down arrow buttons on the right-hand spoke actually do. Through it, you view a pair of clearly designated instrument dials separated by the usual trip computer display. Practical touches around the cabin include twin cup holders between the seats, by the thankfully conventional handbrake, behind which lie a couple of parking ticket slots and a shallow tray. More storage is provided by a cubby ahead of the gear stick, which is obviously intended for your phone, incorporating as it does a USB point and a 12-volt socket. There's no overhead compartment for your sunglasses or under-seat stowage, but you do get a big glove box and decently sized door pockets, plus a small compartment by the driver's right knee and another built into the door armrest. What we haven't really mentioned much so far, though, is the sheer spaciousness that the ZS can offer by class standards. We're going to get a real idea of that here on the back seat. With small crossovers, it's usually in this part of the car that you're reminded of their Super Mini origins. Not in this case. As you'd expect, the extra exterior length and width we referred to earlier really pay dividends here. In fact, MG claims that the kind of room on offer in the rear of a ZS is much more comparable with the kind of space you'd get from a Qashqai class family hatchback-based SUV from the next class up. And there's some truth in that. The notably low centre transmission tunnel even means that you could theoretically seat 3 adults alongside each other back here, or at least you would be able to do that if this bench was better sculpted. As it is, this narrow centre seating position is really only suitable for children. Still, provided there are only two of you, you'll find what's on offer back here to be an absolute world away from the cramped quarters provided by most comparable B-segment SUVs. Heads and shoulders are both well catered for. MG says there's 80mm more headroom and 55mm more shoulder space than the segment average. Legroom's generous too, the amount of room provided for your knees being especially good. Storage room is reasonable thanks to seat back pockets, reasonable door bins and access to this middle stowage tray. Finally, securing a child seat should be easy thanks to Isofix mounts fitted in the two outer chairs. Finally, let's take a look in the boot. What can we expect here? To give you some perspective before we start, a typical B-segment SUV model like Nissan's Juke offers 354 litres of boot space. A pricier, larger C-segment favourite like a Nissan Qashqai will give you 430 litres. This ZS easily undercuts both these crossovers on price and gives you, well, let's press in the tailgate badge, open it and see. 448 litres. Quite a lot then. And actually only 35 litres less than you get in MG's supposedly much larger GS SUV model. Popular rivals in the small crossover class like Ford's EcoSport and Mazda CX-3 are over 90 litres short of this figure. What else do you need to know? Well, there's a useful dual height boot floor. You get these useful corner stowage areas on each side, and there's an underfloor compartment that we'd recommend that you fill with the optional run-flat spare wheel. If you drop the 60-40 split folding rear bench, you'll create a reasonably flat load area with a luggage capacity that increases to a maximum of 1,375 litres. That's actually more than you'd get in that larger GS model. The MG brand is still some way up from having a fundamental unique selling point unconnected with price. So, for the time being at least, the reality is that potential customers for this model will be people who, first of all, look at its sticker figure, then, if that's attractive, take a closer look at the product itself. MG dealers tasked with selling this car have been pleased to note that the figures in question have been extremely eye-catching. At launch, in entry-level Explore guise, this car cost just £12,500, undercutting almost all of its potential rivals by a significant sum. With the base version, you only get a single engine and transmission combination, a 1.5 litre petrol unit offering 106 PS, borrowed from the company's MG3 Super Mini and mated to a 5-speed manual gearbox. You can have the same combination with mid-range Excite trim for around £14,000 or with this top exclusive spec for around £15,500. However, with these mid-range and flagship trim levels, there's also an alternative drive combination, a more modern 3-cylinder 1-litre turbo power plant putting out 111 PS and available only with 6-speed automatic transmission. For this upgraded drivetrain package, there's a £2,000 premium to find, which means that for a top ZS exclusive 1-litre auto variant like the one we're trying here, you'd need a budget of around £17,500. From launch anyway, that was the most you could pay for this car. There won't ever be a diesel option or any kind of four-wheel drive system offered. MG says that buyers of small SUVs have no appetite for either of these things. We heard these same comments from the brand at the launch of this car's showroom stablemate, MG's other compact SUV, the GS. That car, which competes against Qashqai class crossovers in the next segment up, has a slightly more powerful petrol engine and a slightly bigger cabin, but otherwise offers little else to justify a price premium over this ZS model of £2,500 to £3,500, depending on variant. As a result, it's difficult not to think that GS sales will be hit quite hard by the availability of this even more competitively priced contender. On to the value proposition offered by ZS pricing in the small crossover segment, which looks pretty strong. The only SUV in the class able to undercut this MG's asking figures is the Romanian-built Dacia Duster, priced from around £10,000. But that car costs significantly more to run, has a shorter warranty, and is much clunkier to drive. The other directly price comparable small SUV you could consider in this sector is SsangYong's Tivoli. The entry-level version of that Korean contender is priced from around £13,500 in a form that includes air conditioning as standard, making a base Tivoli directly competitive with a £14,000 mid-range 1.5-litre Excite version of this ZS. But again, these same comments in terms of running costs, warranty provision and driving dynamics apply. Which leads us to conclude that if financial restraints force you towards a budget brand in consideration of a car of this kind, then the ZS looks an extremely strong proposition. MG, though, reckons that this car is strong enough to stand comparisons with the small SUVs produced by more mainstream makers in this class. And if, having tried it, you agree, then the news is basically all good. Everything else you could look at in this sector is more expensive, and usually much, much more expensive. Let's flesh that out a bit. If we were shopping in this segment with an eye on the bottom line, we'd be quite attracted by the thought of an entry-level Citroën C3 Aircross for around £14,000. But that sum only gets you that car with a feeble 82 brake horsepower engine, which will feel extremely slothful after a spin in a 1.5-litre ZS. With a more comparable power plant, that Citroën will cost you from around £15,500, which is about the same kind of sum you'll need for base versions of popular segment choices like the Nissan Juke, Renault's Captur and the Fiat 500X. Stretch your budget to just under £17,000 and you could look at getting yourself into entry-level versions of cars like the Seat Arona, the Kia Stonic, the Ford EcoSport, the Vauxhall Crossland X and the Hyundai Kona. Or, if you're happy to go for a slightly older design in this sector, the Suzuki Vitara and the Mitsubishi ASX. It's far more likely, though, that with all the small SUVs I've just mentioned, you'll actually find yourself paying somewhere in the £17,500 to £18,500 bracket if you want a version of either of these models fitted out with the kind of equipment you get as standard with this MG. And for that kind of money, your list of small SUV options begins to open even wider to include contenders like Mazda's CX-3, Suzuki's SX4 S-Cross, Jeep's Renegade and the Volkswagen T-Cross. But enough with the alternatives. The bottom line is that in choosing an MG ZS, you'll probably be saving yourself around £2,500 to £3,500 over the cost of the mainstream branded small SUV you might previously have been considering. Now, if that sounds attractive, then the deal might be sealed by a strong showing by this car when it comes to standard equipment provision. Has MG cut corners here? Let's see. As we mentioned earlier, the range starts with base Explore trim, and even this variant comes with cruise control, automatic headlamps that illuminate when the lights begins to fade, and Bluetooth phone connectivity. There's also a trip computer, powered mirrors, a USB point, and LED daytime running lights. Unfortunately, you don't get two key features that a lot of buyers will be looking for: air conditioning and a DAB tuner. For those, you'll need to stretch to mid-range Excite trim, which is probably the sweet spot in the lineup, giving you many of the niceties that MG wants to talk about with this car. Things like the 8-inch centre dash infotainment touchscreen with its Apple CarPlay smartphone mirroring connectivity, and the multi-mode steering system that allows you to alter weighting at the helm depending on the way that you want to drive. Other Excite standard features include 17-inch turbine-style alloy wheels, roof rails, front fog lights, heated mirrors, rear parking sensors, and a 6-way adjustable driver's seat. In this case, though, we've gone straight to the top of the range and opted to test the exclusive model that many will want. Here you get 17-inch alloy wheels with a sleek diamond-cut finish, leather-trimmed seats and a rear parking camera. Plus there's MG's iGo satellite navigation system. On to options. Bear in mind that unless you want your ZS painted in Arctic white, you'll need to pay extra for one of the optional metallic colours. There's also a tri-coat dynamic red finish if you really want your ZS to stand out. That's what we've got here. What MG doesn't provide is the option of the kind of contrast coloured roof that most competitors offer, which could potentially disappoint more fashion-conscious folk. For these people, MG provides an optional coloured decal kit and a chromed tailgate finisher. As for practical options, well, we'd want the optional space saver spare wheel and possibly also the roof crossbars, the load space liner and the rubber mat set. Buyers will also be offered mud guards, a dog guard and a tow bar. Enough with the options. Let's talk about safety equipment. Don't go expecting the latest camera-driven electronic devices here. MG isn't quite ready for that. Unfortunately, the current Euro NCAP safety test is, and limits contenders without autonomous braking style features to a 3-star rather than a 5-star score. Still, at least in a ZS, all the fundamental basics do seem to have been covered. So every variant comes with driver, passenger, side and curtain airbags as standard. Plus, of course, there's ABS braking along with brake force distribution to help the car pull up in a straight line during emergency situations. As you'd expect in a modern car, ESP stability control is included too. This particular system fitted out with CBC corner brake control to help the car around corners by gently applying the anchors to the inside wheels on a bend. There's also what MG calls an anti-rolling protection system that uses the traction control to dab the brakes to help prevent the car from rolling over during dangerous manoeuvres, say if you had to take extreme action to avoid hitting a pedestrian who'd suddenly stepped out in front of you. In addition, there are twin Isofix child seat mounts on the 2 outer rear chairs, a hill hold feature that stops the car from sliding backwards during uphill starts, and tyre pressure monitoring too. The Chinese brand has done well to minimise the efficiency downside for those graduating to this ZS SUV from their MG3 Super Mini. This crossover can't be as aerodynamic as that smaller model, and it's about 65 kilograms heavier, but its running cost figures are hardly any different. The 1.5-litre manual ZS variant managing 49.6 miles to the gallon on the combined cycle and 129 grams per kilometre of CO2. You'll read plenty of reviews telling you that this is some way behind the ultimate class standard, which is true. A small SUV with a more modern 3-cylinder turbo unit mated to a manual gearbox will normally improve on this showing by about 10%. But those kinds of engines aren't usually fitted to entry-level versions of models in this class, which means that for a small crossover able to improve on the running cost figures being posted here, you'll probably be looking at an asking price that'll be in the region of around £3,000 more. For a proper like-for-like efficiency comparison to what's on offer with this MG, you need to be looking at the base variants of mainstream rivals, the ones the magazines don't tend to talk about. Do that and you get a slightly different picture. The cheapest 1.6-litre versions of cars in this class, like the Nissan Juke and the Mitsubishi ASX, actually can't match the running cost figures of a 1.5-litre MG ZS. And base 1.6-litre versions of the Fiat 500X and the Jeep Renegade are way off. In addition, we've mentioned elsewhere in this review that other budget brand rivals in this sector, like base petrol versions of the Dacia Duster and the SsangYong Tivoli, cost a lot more to run. And even some more recently introduced contenders, a base Kia Stonic 1.4 MPI, for example, are hardly any cleaner or more frugal. So, not a bad showing, considering the development constraints that MG had to work under here. What we have found to be a touch disappointing are the figures returned by the GM-sourced 1-litre turbo auto model that we've been trying for this test. After looking at the relatively encouraging readings of the 1.5-litre version, our hopes were reasonably high here. After all, this is a much more modern engine, a unit that when fitted to a Vauxhall Corsa delivers over 55 miles to the gallon and under 115 grams per kilometre of CO2. Taking into account this SUV's extra weight and the imposition of an auto gearbox, we'd expected a drop of around 10% from that. But as it is, the owner of a 1-litre turbo auto ZS model must be content with a best case scenario of 44.8 miles to the gallon on the combined cycle and 144 grams per kilometre of CO2. Still, take account of what you'll save on the upfront asking price by choosing this ZS, and you could still be looking at this car being a more cost-effective proposition over a typical 3-year ownership period, despite the uncertain residuals that are an inevitable part of buying into a lesser-known brand. If you want to do better than the fuel and CO2 figures that the conventional petrol engines can provide, then it might be worth talking to your dealer about the plug-in hybrid powertrain also developed for this car. Now, though this package wasn't available from launch, MG bosses were keen to talk about it. Technology that sees the ZS-E variant in question use an uprated 1.5-litre petrol turbo engine mated to an electric motor, putting out about 40 brake horsepower. What about other running cost issues? Well, all versions of this MG come with an impressive 7-year, 80,000-mile warranty as standard, which is better than most rival brands can offer. Now, you might be aware that rival Kia offers a 7-year, 100,000-mile package, but MG still reckons its deal is preferable because it's backed by full factory support throughout, whereas direct manufacturer support for rival warranties declines the longer they go on. In many cases, they don't go on too long. Many competitors still limit you to a 3-year backup package. A few offer 5 years. MG does better. This is the brand putting its money where its mouth is. Additionally, there's a 6-year factory warranty against rust, while a year's breakdown cover is also part of the deal. As for servicing, the MG requires a scheduled maintenance stop every 15,000 miles or 12 months, depending on which comes around sooner. Prepaid servicing packages are available through the e-Dynamics program that dealers offer. Finally, let's look at insurance. The 1.5-litre models fall into Group 11E, while the 1-litre variants are rated at Group 10E. The ZS is evidence of MG's growing confidence as a car maker and of the evolution of the brand. In its Chinese-owned era, the company started with a product customers largely didn't want, the MG6 family hatch, then progressed through one that was at least more relevant, the MG3 Super Mini, to one that properly fitted in with market trends, the GS mid-sized SUV. Now, though, at last they've progressed as far as offering one that's truly class competitive. What that means is that you can enjoy the large price saving this car offers over mainstream competitors without feeling that you've opted for a significantly inferior product. There's quite a lot to be said for that. In fact, there are plenty of things about this MG that you might conceivably prefer to some rivals. Were we to be shopping in this segment, we'd certainly be impressed by the class-leading levels of interior space, and we'd value the long 7-year warranty and the high standards of equipment you get for the money. And in summary, well, is this the best car in the sector? No. Is it the best really affordable model in the class? Almost certainly yes. For MG, that represents a significant achievement.